Sudbury Town is one of the most acclaimed stations on the Underground. Its design is generally considered superb, pioneering a style that would set the standard for stations all over the network. It's even listed as a building of national significance. Yet the guy it was built for was not at all happy with it. What gives? Today, Sudbury Town is on the Piccadilly line. But when it was built, it was on the District line, or rather, the Metropolitan District Railway. This was a line known as the Ealing and South Harrow Railway, which the district built but never opened, having run out of money. In 1901, the district was bought out by Underground Electric Railways of London, or UERL, who decided to use this line to test out their new electrification equipment. Sudbury Town was opened in 1903, but it looked very different back then. It was much smaller and little more than a corrugated iron shack. The name was kind of inaccurate at the time, as it was in fact a fair way from the actual Sudbury Town. Railways have never been ones to let truth get in the way of a good station name. By the late 1920s, the various public transport systems of London were moving towards a more modern way of doing things. UERL aimed to create an integrated and efficient system out of the competing and often illogical lines that they owned. So the District Railways branches to Hounslow and Uxbridge were to be turned over to their subsidiary, London Electric Railways, and LER's subsidiary, the Piccadilly line. All this corporate manoeuvring is rather complicated, and I feel like I should do a video on it someday. If I can avoid a migraine. The long and short of it was, Sudbury Town would go from the District line to the Piccadilly. Along with their new acquisitions, the Piccadilly line was to be fully modernised. That meant new trains, like this one here, and new stations. One of the key brains behind the modernisation of the Piccadilly line was Frank Pick. Pick was the commercial manager, and he had an interest, practically an obsession, with efficiency. His priority was to create a network that was quick and easy to use. It was on Pick's watch that we got the Harry Beck tube map, one of the great design icons of the 20th century. This belief in efficiency extended to architecture, and in this he had an ally in the form of Charles Holden. Holden was an architect who believed that aesthetics and utility could go hand in hand, so of course Pick snapped him up when UERL were planning new stations. Holden's first major work for UERL was the Morden extension of what's now the Northern Line. That was good. Very good, in fact. Holden stations on that line are all still in use with very little alteration. But Pick thought they could do better. In the mid-20s, a new architectural movement was coming into vogue in Europe. Modernism. This is a very complex subject, but what's important for our purposes was that some of the central characteristics were clear function and clean lines. Holden and Pick undertook fact-finding missions to Europe to see what was what. Pick was particularly impressed by some of the new stations on the Berlin U-Bahn, which were easy to use but also easy on the eye. The two men were also inspired by American ideas of including a large concourse for free movement. This new architecture was assisted by advances in technology, engineering, building materials and lighting. All would be key factors in the design of Sudbury Town, which was to be the testbed for Pick and Holden's concepts. In fact, some of the early plans refer to it as the experimental station. Why Sudbury Town? Well, as it was frankly a bit of a dump. It had been built on the cheap to serve an area with few residents, and over 20 years later the area was still quite sparsely populated. What this meant was that there was room to play around with concepts. There was space to build something big, and there wasn't the kind of pressure they'd have if they built something in central London. The station itself consisted of two platforms serving a single branch of a single line. It didn't have the complexity of, say, Acton Town, so the design team could concentrate on the architecture in its simplest form. The design underwent a number of refinements. An early version consisted of a tall single entrance with wings 3 stories high and including space for flats on top. This was considered a bit much. The concept was simplified and reduced. The one window with the stained glass roundel was replaced with 4 windows. In fact, when you visit Sudbury Town, one of the most striking things about it is how much light and space there is. The single entrance of Holden's original design was turned into 4 so that incoming passengers wouldn't run into those leaving the station. Dutch modernist architects saw no reason why traditional materials like bricks and wood could have no place in the 20th century, and we see that here. Holden referred to his new style as a brick box with a lid, incorporating brick and concrete as appropriate. Brick fitted in with the suburban surroundings of the line, and it tended to look better as it weathered than concrete. It also looked rather warmer than concrete or the Portland stone used on the Morden project. There's a lot of wood here too, the barriers, the perimeter, and the benches. Traditional materials also meant that traditional methods of building could be used. In fact, the only real problem encountered during building was the roof, which was cast in concrete and proved very difficult to make. Concrete was also used in the footbridge, the waiting rooms, the platform fences, and the light fittings, but it's never allowed to overwhelm the station. For me, when I think of Holden's stations, it's the brick buildings that spring to mind. While we're talking about the concrete fittings, I think it's interesting that the footbridge includes ramps, making it one of the more accessible stations of the 30s. Something everyone notices about Sudbury town is the unusual typeface of the signs. Underground stations typically used the Johnston typeface, named after its designer, Edward Johnston. It's considered a very readable, unfussy typeface. At Sudbury, there's a variation known as Johnston Delph Smith, designed by Percy Delph Smith, which incorporates a wedge serif. It was also used at number 55 Broadway, the underground headquarters, but it never really caught on. Sudbury Town is the only station that still uses it. As part of UERL's aim to run London's transport as a holistic network, there's a large space for buses at the front of the station. Although it has to be said that the station isn't the centrepiece of the suburb that some others are. It's a big station with a big frontage, but it's also in the back streets. Its presence needs to be signalled by a sign off the main road. The buses look a little incongruous to me, driving down a narrow residential road. The new station was opened in 1932. The lessons learned in its design and construction would be repeated elsewhere on the network, and indeed still influence underground stations to this day. Baird Dennison of the Architect's Journal considered it a revitalisation of British station design. But Frank Pick was highly critical of the end result. The reason was that he felt the interior was, how can we put this, impure. The interior fittings, including lighting and furniture, were designed and placed by outside contractors. To Pick's mind, it was cluttered and disorganised, nothing like what he envisaged. J.P. Thomas, the operating manager of the London Passenger Transport Board, considered it to be shabby. Oddly enough, one of Thomas' other criticisms of this and other Piccadilly line stations was that they were too well built. If traffic patterns changed, it would be expensive to rebuild them. Not much that Pick and Holden could do about that now, but Pick insisted from then on that in future stations, all the elements would be the responsibility of the architectural team. The station has seen changes over the years. The roundel on the front is a later addition. Originally, there was a neon sign at the top to advertise the station's presence. The concrete lampposts are actually replicas. In 2020, a new art installation appeared by Lucy Mackenzie, inspired by commercial art of the 1920s and entitled Pleasure's Inaccuracies. Whatever Pick and Thomas might have thought, most enthusiasts of the Underground consider Sudbury Town to be a rousing success. Indeed, there are many who consider it to be aesthetically the best. Perhaps Pick needed to dial the control freak tendencies back a bit. Well, I hope you enjoyed this modernist tale from the tube. If so, please do click the like button and subscribe for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your much appreciated support. You are the lid to my brick box. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.